All right, so you just got ZBrush 2021 installed and you're ready to go. It should look similar to this. I made some slight modifications to my interface. And if you're brand new to ZBrush, I would suggest going to like my YouTube channel and watching this new Intro to ZBrush series, or go to my ArtStation page. It's on here as well, and you can just watch these 50 videos, get you up and running on the basics of ZBrush. And also, you know, any new releases that I do where it's like, hey, 2019, 2020, 2021, what's new? Which will be on here shortly. It's what I'm recording as we speak. That'll all be on there for you to get kind of caught up. So if you want to know more about like creating your own custom interface and the basics of ZBrush, that's where I would start. Having said that, if you're in ZBrush and you see this light box, you can hit the comma key to get rid of it, or if you want to hit the comma key and go over here, we're going to be getting to these in a minute. These are basically new projects you can kind of get acclimated with the new dynamic interface. But what I'm going to do is we're just going to start fresh, start vanilla. We're going to go over some very basic functionality because I know you're all excited to get into that dynamic menu that's up here. So, to do that, let's go ahead and double click this divider over here, and if you have a menu in here, you can keep it in here. I'm just going to take this dynamics menu, grab that little white circle, and just drag it over here to the top. And first things first, I'm going to go over here to our primitives, and we're going to grab a plain 3D, drag it out in our document here. Let's go into edit mode, where you can hit the T key. You see if I hover over that, that's going to see that's the hotkey for that. And if you hold down Control, that'll give you even more information, a little help menu that's built into ZBrush. Over here, I'm going to turn on the floor so we can see it. And by default, most things in ZBrush are set up to be Z forward. So this blue line is forward. This red line is X symmetry, or the X axis, and that's going to be left and right. And then Y is up and down. And orienting yourself in space is going to be important when we're talking about dynamics, because, you know, gravity is going to affect certain things. And also when we go in here and start inflating and contracting in different axes, you're going to need to be aware of which axes you're talking about. So we have a plane in here and we have a floor. Then over here in our dynamics, you're going to see we have gravity turned on by default and floor collision on by default. So in order to get this to work, and if you open up your subtool menu, you see we just have one subtool in here. So the only thing this cloth is going to collide with is this floor because we have it turned on. So if I just run the simulation, it's going to yell at me. I don't have a Polymesh 3D selected. So when I drag this out, we're basically in primitive mode. So I dragged it out and I didn't hit this Make Polymesh 3D, which means we can go down here to initialize and change any number of these parameters to get a more specific plane. In this case, all I want to do is just go up here and hit Make Polymesh 3D. Now it's a sculptable plane. I can go in here with the brushes and I can manipulate this geometry. So now it is acceptable to run dynamics on. So we'll go ahead and turn off polyframe here. As you can see this plane. And again, we'll just have gravity turned on, we'll run the simulation, and it's just going to fall straight to the ground. Now, the gravity strength is pretty high, so if you want to slow that simulation down, let's go ahead and turn that strength down a little bit, say maybe 2.2, and then now as we run it, it's running a little bit slower. You're also going to see if we move this camera around to the back, it's going to disappear. You can go down here to display properties at the very bottom, and you can turn on double, and you can see both sides. But what we're going to do is there's a new option in here called Geometry under Dynamic Subdivision. This isn't new, this has been in ZBrush before, but now if we turn on Dynamic, it's automatically going to want to smooth your subdivisions up by 2. Let's go ahead and turn that down to 0 for now. There's a new thickness slider in here, so we can go ahead and crank this thickness up. And we'll talk more about some of these options later on in the series. But for now, what I want you to see is that it's actually giving you a dynamic thickness. By dynamic, I mean it's just a preview. So if I hit D, that turns on dynamic. If I do Shift D, that turns it off. When I hit D again, it's going to ask you, hey, you want to turn on dynamic subdivisions? And you're going to say yes. So now Shift D and D turns that on and off, and now you're going to see when I have dynamic turned on, it's telling it, give me some thickness on that plane. So now when I rerun that simulation, you're going to see front and back, and you're going to see it a little bit better. Now if you want to make this real geometry, again, we'll get to this later, you can just hit apply and it'll give you actual geometry back here. Right now, it's just, again, a preview mesh. Now one thing you may notice is when you go over here and you run the simulation, it's hitting the floor, but it's kind of disregarding itself. If you want the simulation to be more aware of itself and basically the geometry that it contains and run calculations based on the actual geometry that makes up this object. Let's go over here. Since I have polyframe turned on, I'm going to go over here and change this to skin shader 4 so it shows up a little bit brighter for you. I can go over here and I can turn on this self collision. So as I crank this up, it's going to be, again, it's going to be running these calculations on this cloth, and it's going to be more aware of itself. And now you're going to see it's colliding with itself as it falls. Now over here, we turn down the smooth subdivision, it's actually kind of cool to turn it on. So as we start running the simulation, see how it's kind of blocky? There's not a whole lot of geometry here for it to simulate. But we can get a smooth preview if you kind of go over here and you crank that up 1 or 2 or 3, let's say 2. Again, it's not real geometry just yet, but you're getting a preview of what it would look like if you subdivided it. So it'll give you a little bit more of a nicer result. So I'm going to undo that and we'll turn this back up to 2. So now as I'm running this simulation, go back to our matte cap gray. So I'm going to switch between like matte cap gray, which is a startup material for me, but for you be over here in the corner, and then also Skin Shader 4, just to kind of preview different options. So as I run the simulation now you're going to get kind of a smoother result. It's still actually only simulating this low-res geometry, but we're telling ZBrush, give us a preview of a thickness and also give us a preview of a little bit of a smoother result. Let's go ahead and hit undo. And let's hit W. We're going to go into gizmo mode. I'm going to hold down Shift, and you're going to see we're going to snap to increments. And now I'm just going to have this laying on the floor plane. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn off floor collision. I don't want it to collide with the floor. And we're going to have the ability to add our own custom collision objects. You're going to see collision volumes over here. We're going to get to that in the later videos. But for now, we're just going to focus on this nice plane we have. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the floor so we don't get confused. And I'm going to hit Q, or you can go up here and you can touch draw. So basically, W goes into move, and that's gizmo move, or E or R. With gizmo, it's all the same. And then draw is Q, and then you can just go over here, and that's when you can start sculpting on your mesh. So if you had like the standard brush selected, you can go through here, and you can select brushes in here. So now we have gravity, and we have some gravity options. We've turned down strength a little bit, and if we run the simulation now, you're going to see it's just going to fall through space. That's the default gravity, just kind of doing what you're telling it to do, which is essentially I have a plane and just have gravity pull at this plane in a void, and it just kind of floats down. You're also going to see there's a liquefy option. So I'm going to go into my move brush. We're going to get BMV, and that's going to select your move brush for you. If you're new to ZBrush, if you hit B for the brush menu, it's going to load up your brush menu, and M is going to narrow it down to the M brushes. That starts with the letter M, and then V or just tapping move will give you your move brush. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put little dimples. I'm just going to kind of push on my mesh in these 3 areas here and kind of deform this mesh. And if I don't do that, if I do gravity liquefy, it's not going to go anywhere. It doesn't have any edges to simulate against using this liquefy option. But if I go through here now and I kind of put some dimples in here, that's going to deform the mesh so it has edge information it can use to go ahead and simulate appropriately. So now if I have gravity liquefy and we run the simulation, it's going to start pulling from those points. And you're going to see it gives us a much more liquid result. So let's go ahead and let's turn up our gravity strength. Let's go ahead and make these dimples a little bit more robust. And then now when we run that simulation, you're going to see it's almost like it's falling through water as it falls off the screen, because we don't have a floor collision for it to collide with or another collision volume, so it's just going to continue to fall. But now you can see the difference between, gravity and running the simulation and liquefy gravity, which is going to treat it as if it's like falling through water. Now let's turn our floor back on, and we'll undo back to where we had our regular plane here. And it's just kind of sitting this way, and you see that floor appears at the bottom of our mesh now. So now when I use gravity and liquefy, you can see, let's turn on floor collision. You're going to see that's the result we get. It's very similar in this instance to just regular gravity, but again, if you go through here and give it something to simulate against, you can start seeing it kind of do that through water kind of gravity. And just a few more ways to manipulate this cloth. Again, we're just starting out. We're just kind of getting acclimated to the environment. We're going to go through a lot more examples of how to do these things, but we can do brush transpose, B, T, and then C. We have a new transpose cloth. So this will actually allow you to kind of use transpose to kind of push and move this object or rotate this object and have it collide with the floor in this case. Also, we hit W to go into BT transpose cloth, or smart transpose, or regular transpose, which is BTR. This is regular transpose. You're going to see it's not going to do anything with cloth simulations. You can also hit Q to go back into draw mode. We're going to hit BC to narrow it down to the cloth brushes, or the brushes that start with C. And now you can grab any of these. You can use like cloth hook, BCK, and you can go through here. You can just start pulling this cloth around. Now again, we're going to go into more options and talk more about these features and what these things mean as we go through the series. But just as a really quick example, Let's go to BC Twister and go through here. You can make your own cloth brushes. You can hold down Alt if you want to twist in the other direction, and you can do all sorts of cool stuff with these brushes and these different options that you have available to you in this new Dynamics menu, as well as combining that with this new dynamic subdiv with the thickness, and even cooler, you can turn micro poly on. You can maybe grab some chainmail. Let's turn our smooth subdiv down. And now we have a chainmail cloth that we can go through here and manipulate and simulate on the ground. It gets really, really cool. You're going to love this series, I promise. But that's kind of the basics to get you started with a polyplane in ZBrush. And just real quick, let's hit the comma key. Let's go into our tool menu and let's double click that dog Z tool. Just so you're aware, you don't have to be super confined with your choices when it comes to dynamic simulation. It'll run on anything. I can go here, gravity, liquefy, have that dog running through water and just collapse on the ground. There's inflate options. As you run this, it'll keep it inflated a little bit. We can turn down that gravity. We can turn off liquefy. This is a little bit more of a normal gravity applied to this mesh. We can crank up, inflate as it goes. So now it's inflating that geometry out. It's got kind of an open mesh here. Let's go ahead and say geometry, modify topology. Let's go ahead and close holes on this object. So now when we run the simulation, all these holes will be closed. So we can inflate, we can use gravity, we can use our transpose cloths, again, BTC to go through here. Let's go ahead and turn off inflate so it doesn't inflate anymore. And now we can go back in here to geometry, turn on dynamic. We don't need any thickness, but maybe we want to turn on this smooth a little bit so we can get a little bit of a preview of what this will look like when we make it smooth, and then you can rerun that gravity simulation over here. You can change the strength up so it'll run faster. Go in here with your twister brush and twist this cloth around. Again, you can use it on almost anything in ZBrush as long as it's geometry. Have fun with it. And again, we'll talk more about these options as we continue to move through the series. Now, that's as far as I was going to take the intro, but then I noticed online there was a lot of confusion over some very pertinent information over here in your Dynamics menu that I'm going to bring up now, and that's basically simulation strengths and gravity. So I'm going to go over here, and we have an object, and we've talked about colliding with the floor already. So if we have floor turned on over here, floor collision, and we have gravity, and we run this, it'll go ahead and collide with the floor. However, if we want, we can go in here to say append a sphere, and we got a sphere in here, and we got a plane. So I'm going to take this plane, I'm going to hold down shift and rotate it around. And let's also take this sphere and let's go ahead and shrink it down. So I'm going to alt tap this sphere, or plane, I can go ahead and select it. And we have the sphere showing. So, we can have it collide with the floor, and we can have it collide with that sphere. How I do that is, you want to have the object you want to simulate selected, and then the objects you want to collide. And it can be multiple objects. You can have multiple subtools that it'll collide with. But essentially, with this one selected, I'm going to go down here and I say collision volume. I'm going to turn that on. Or if it's already on, you can hit recalculate. And then I'll go ahead and give you a new collision volume, which is essentially this little sphere down here. Now, of course, there's a lot more information we'll go over in collision volume later, but this is kind of just another basic overview. So now when I have gravity turned on, and we can have self-collision turned up a little bit as well. We've got our geometry plane dynamics, that divide smoothed up a couple times, floor collision turned on. When I run the simulation, it's going to run, and that's going to be the result I get. Now, I didn't do too bad, and I think these are all default settings in here, but let's try this. Let's undo that. Let's hit W and pull this way up, and let's also tap the sphere, and I'm going to pull this up. There's another thing in here too, is as I drag this up, that floor is going to keep following. If you want to change where that is, underneath it's basically the floor is set to -1, which means the lowest subtool in my scene, whatever the lowest point on that is where the floor is going to be drawn. And it's a rendering thing, so when you go to render, you can render a contact shadow. If you don't want that, just turn elevation here to 0, and that'll keep it snapped down here. So now we can continue moving this up. Now, if I have this selected and I hit recalculate collision volume, it's going to calculate this. Let's go ahead and do it. It'll calculate this as a collision volume. And then if I go to BTC, which is your transpose cloth brush, I can go up here and just kind of smash this sphere into that collision volume. But that's not exactly what I'm looking for. I'm going to alt tap this plane. I hit Q to go back into draw mode. We're going to recalculate our collision volume, so that's going to calculate this sphere as our collision volume, run the simulation, and now you're going to say, okay, it's simulated, but boy, it's really stretching hard on that sphere over there. So again, just a couple basic things that you need to know, basic sets and parameters over here that we're going to go over in detail later, but essentially what you're fighting with is, you're not really fighting. We turn off dynamic, here's our geometry. And when you're telling a cloth simulation to run, essentially what it's going to be looking for is these relationships with your surface area and your edges. And again, we'll get more in depth in this when we start talking about inflate and deflate and expand and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, if I go to BCK, and that's going to be cloth hook, and I go through here and I pull this around, if I pull it slowly, you're going to see it maintains those relationships pretty well. And that's because you're running the simulation iterations up here saying, hey, you know what? On every movement, calculate all of these points and make sure they're maintaining those relationships. So it's not like real life where if you pull a towel really fast, it's not going to stretch physically. But because it's on a computer and it's 3D and it's having to calculate to maintain surface area, you can, in this world, pull fast enough to where it just breaks it or it just stretches really crazy. You know, you can allow it to do that. To avoid letting it do that, there's two things you can do. Number one, move it slower. So if I want to move in that direction, if I pull it slowly, it'll give the calculations time to update and maintain those relationships as you go forward. However, you can also go up here to simulation iterations and you can crank that up. So if you crank it up to 1,000, what that's going to say is on every movement, run 1,000 iterations per movement. And that's really going to give you a much more stable, a much more predictable surface area. So all these, every time I move, all those points are calculating against each other and saying, hey, are we still in a good relationship as we're colliding and falling? Are the relationships between us pretty good to maintain that surface area? So in fact, if I undo back through here to where we just have our flat plane, and we turn on gravity. If I have simulation iterations up at 100 or 1,000, and I have my gravity strength still set at 10, and I run the simulation, it's going to fall fast, but see how much better it does? No stretching. Here's another thing you can do. You can keep simulation iterations down at 100, but while gravity is falling, see how fast it falls? Just slow down your gravity. So you essentially slow down your gravity, and as it falls, as it starts deforming across the surface, those calculations are going to kick in, and it's going to have time to compute all those relationships so that by the time it settles in, you're fine. So here's low simulation iterations, but also slow gravity. Same thing when you're moving it. So again, brush transpose cloth. If I move slowly, no problem. It drapes just fine. Everybody's happy. If I move fast, it's going to go right through the object. I'll say I move pretty fast. I can start stretching those relationships. So something to keep in mind. While if you're moving too fast and it doesn't have time to calculate those relationships, it's going to stretch. If you're simulating too fast and it doesn't have time to calculate those relationships, you need to slow the simulation down, or you need to add more iterations so it has time to calculate, on the fly as you're moving. If I crank the simulations up to 1,000 and then I move fast, it'll still maintain pretty good. So I moved that pretty fast and it bounced back. It was like, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm going to keep calculating and I'm going to maintain those distance relationships. Now, here's another thing. Let's turn this back down to 100, and our gravity's working pretty good. We'll say it like maybe 2.5. You can also, this is where like firmness comes into play. So we can turn this firmness down to 1, and now let's hit Q, and then we'll run that simulation, and it runs, and it's still pretty stretchy, but you can also see it's very silky as a simulation. Let's go back into dynamic and turn on some subdiv and some thickness so we can kind of see that in action. So you can see it maintain those relationships pretty good. It's a little stretchy, and if you want to rectify that or you want to make that a little bit better, let's crank that gravity down and then just run that simulation nice and slow so that, and maybe I'll have to be that slow. Let's say 1.3 instead of 2.5. And again, it's going to allow those calculations to take place and still allow a very silky material. Also notice we have self-collision turned up, so that way it's aware of itself. Now that's another calculation it has to run. Remember, it's colliding with the sphere, it's colliding with the floor, it's colliding with the collision volume, and it's colliding with itself. And so that's a lot of information it has to calculate. So that fix that stretching on there. But if we want to keep that gravity up and have it go real fast, crank those simulation iterations, and now when we run it, it'll go nice and fast and be nice and silky and collide with itself, and you get a nice result. On the flip side, if you crank this firmness up, and let's drop this back down to 100 and keep our gravity up, it'll still have a pretty, it might be a little stretchy up here, but the firmness is set so high it's going to act like a really thick piece of leather. Let's drop that firmness down to like 4. And then run that again. There we go. So now you can see it's kind of stretching here, and then these aren't nearly as silky. I guess what I could do is we can go turn the floor off here. Let's do Shift S to store that one. And then we're going to drop that firmness down to 2. And we'll undo. And then we'll run this again. And you know what? I'm going to crank that simulation iterations down, or up. So I can go ahead and grab all these. And then now when we compare these two, here's a firmness of 2. Here's a firmness of 5 or 6, I forget which. And even then, this was with lower simulation iterations. So if I turn this up to 6 and keep the simulation iterations up to 1,000, and I redo it, that's the result I get. It's evaluating so many times, it doesn't even give it a chance to actually compress and hang on here before it starts going, hey, I'm supposed to have a very firm relationship. So this is the result we get. And even if it was 5, which it might have been, probably a very similar result. So you can see how important it is, that relationship between simulation iterations and gravity and speed at which you move. If you choose to use your cloth brush, your cloth transpose, or use your simulations, how it's going to affect those interactions and maintain those surface relationships between each other. And again, if you want them to have a nice relationship, iterations high, speed low. And if you want them to, maybe be a little more lax or a little bit more stretchy, simulation iterations low, speed fast. And then you also have the strength up here. The strength is set to 1. Usually I just leave it there, but you can also drop that strength down if you wanted to, again, embrace the stretchiness and not really care too much about maintaining those relationships.